We get to that. You also have some new information on Michael Brown's toxicology report. What can you tell us?
Right, Jake. Preliminary toxicology reports have apparently been completed on the body of Michael Brown, though authorities in Missouri have so far declined to confirm the results to CNN. And a private autopsy authorized by the family of the teenager found that he was shot 4 times in the arm and twice in the head, and that Brown could have survived all but one of those shots, though both sides may be able to use the results to support very different theories about this case. After more than a week of unanswered questions, the first autopsy results only seem to muddy the waters. Police have suggested unarmed teenager Michael Brown was killed after a struggle for the police officer's gun. But results of an autopsy done at a funeral home by renowned medical examiner Michael Baden and a colleague, Professor Sean Parcells, might seem to suggest otherwise.
No evidence of a struggle.
But the absence of such evidence isn't conclusive, according to a former FBI investigator.
The fact that there's not any indication on Mr. Brown certainly doesn't indicate there wasn't a struggle.
The shots also did not appear to have been fired from close range because there would have been gunpowder residue on the body.
There's no gunshot residues on the skin surface.
What we do know now is that Brown was struck by bullets at least 6 times, including 2 shots to the head, one of which was likely fatal.
All of these gunshot wounds were survivable, except for the one in the top of the head that went through the brain.
What is also not clear from these results alone is whether Michael Brown's hands were up as if in surrender or not, which helps determine whether the use of deadly force on an unarmed individual in this situation was justifiable under law. Generally, an officer can shoot if the suspect is threatening serious bodily harm to someone, or if the suspect is a felon fleeing the scene. There are many facts that autopsies, no matter how thorough, won't uncover.
I think in the course of the investigation, some of the things that need to be done is really thoroughly looking into the backgrounds of all the people involved, both Mr. Brown as well as the officer.
A key question may be whether Brown was advancing or acting aggressively at the time he was shot. To put it simply, whether he was retreating, standing still, or if he was moving forward in the direction of the officer when he fired. That remains an open question.
They could be consistent with his going forward or going backward.
So the bottom line is that autopsy reports can only go so far toward determining what really happened, and another autopsy is expected from a federal medical examiner. Jay?
Joe Johns, thank you so much. Let's dig a little deeper into this independent autopsy to try to get a better sense of what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us. Sean Parcells is the forensic pathologist assistant and medical investigator who took part in the autopsy. He joins us now live from St. Louis. Mr. Parcells, thanks so much for joining us. Before we start with the autopsy, I do want to get your reaction to some new information we learned today. The closest thing we have to an account from the officer, someone claiming to have knowledge of the investigation, told a St. Louis radio station that according to Officer Wilson, Michael Brown grabbed the officer's gun, the gun went off, Brown then ran away, and then turned to the officer and bum rushed him, that's a quote, at full speed. That's when the officer started shooting. Now, there are 3 eyewitnesses who say that's not what happened, but I wasn't there, you weren't there. Is there anything from your autopsy consistent with the account of Officer Wilson?
Well, first of all, we don't know, we don't have any evidence that a struggle occurred in the vehicle, and information about that would be a key element that would come from reconstructing the shooting scene. And I think one thing that people need to understand is when you are looking at an autopsy, you have the autopsy of the body and literally the autopsy of the crime scene. And the autopsy of the crime scene really hasn't been done yet. We don't know what happened in the car. And did the gun go off? If it did, which direction was the bullet traveling? These are all things that could be matched up with information to what Dr. Baden and I found at our independent autopsy. The other thing that we need to know about is clothing. If a gunshot wound did hit him at a close range in the vehicle, then there would be gunshot residue on the clothing that would have been filtered out and would not be present on his skin. So when we see it on the table, we see a gunshot wound that looks like it's from a distance when it actually occurred at a close range, but we don't know this because we need to be able to review the clothing. Now, as far as the theory about Mr. Brown rushing the officer, all we know at this point is that the gunshots that occurred to the front part of the body came at a front direction. Does that mean that he was rushing the officer, or does that mean that he was simply standing there and giving up? We can't conclusively prove that off of what we saw. That's where it's very important for the attorneys in this case to really filter out the credible witnesses, and for us to examine those witnesses' statements along with the officer's statements, and then really be able to piece back together what happened.
Right, and I had a witness tell me last week that Brown was walking towards Officer Wilson with his hands in the air, not running, but walking. You don't have access to this forensic evidence. It would seem that if you did, it would be easily confirmable or contradicted whether or not he tried to grab the gun. One would think there might be fingerprints on Officer Wilson's gun that weren't Officer Wilson's, right?
I mean, from a forensic science point of view, yes, that's correct. And those are things that the authorities investigating the car, the equipment used by the officer involved, they really need to look at those details. The thing is, again, to reiterate, is that we hope that they're doing a very thorough investigation of the car, and the events that occurred during the shooting, and being able to reconstruct those and be able to collaborate that with information from the autopsy and filter out what witnesses' statements make sense and don't. And I think that's when you're actually going to really be able to piece together what occurred.
Numerous witnesses say that Brown's arms were up, the universal sign of surrender. It's a chant here on the streets of Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot. Does the trajectory of the gunshot wounds from the autopsy support the idea that his hands were in the air?
Well, the one gunshot wound, if you remember correctly, that I pointed out at the press conference, it's kind of a key gunshot wound, was a gunshot wound that occurred to this part of the arm. And I know that there was one witness statement that had said that she saw Mr. Brown walking away from the officer fires his gun, he kind of jerks like he got shot, and then he turns around. Well, that shot, if it had hit him, could have been the shot that went into this part of the arm, because as you're walking in a normal stance, that part of your arm faces your back. So that shot could have come from the back. But at the same time, when he puts his hands up like this, you can see what part of the arm is exposed towards the officer. So that shot could have also come from the front. The graze wound that occurred here also could have been in different positions with the arm, whether it's up or down. And that's one thing to keep in mind, is that the arm is a very movable part of the body. So those shots can be produced with the arm being in different positions. And that's why we really need to understand the reconstruction of this scene to really be able to confirm whether or not a gunshot came from a particular direction.
Sean, is it normal for a police department to take so long to release the official report of what happened? It seems like we are waiting here for the police to give us information that they've had for days and days. Is this standard operating procedure?
You know, as Dr. Bodden said this morning, and he and I both were really surprised that at least the information that Mr. Brown was shot at least 6 times. The information that we released wasn't released the day after they did the autopsy. All they said was he died by gunshot wounds, but didn't say how many times. As far as the other information that would be released, information about processing of the car and the crime scene, the toxicology report, all those things, those do take time to put together. And when those take time, I'm not surprised that those were a little bit delayed. But what I am surprised about is that at least the preliminary results of the autopsy itself didn't come out sooner than it did.
Surprising indeed. Sean Parcells, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Let's go back to Michelle Kosinski in the White House briefing room, because we are expecting President Obama to come out in fewer than 2 minutes.